Welcome to the Early Buddhism Podcast.
Discerning the world's structural reality through its actual conditions.
To discern the world according to its actual conditions, other than its appearance, subscribe.
Welcome back to the deep dive. You are the learner, the person who doesn't just want to skim the surface of a topic, but really wants to understand the foundational mechanics underneath the hood.
Exactly. We're getting right into the gears today.
Yeah, we've got a really fascinating stack of texts in front of us today exploring Buddhist psychology. Specifically, we are unpacking these incredibly dense ancient suttas. But if you are bracing yourself for some kind of lofty, abstract, philosophical debate about the cosmos, you could definitely relax.
Right, because our mission today is entirely practical.
Entirely practical. It's basically a manual for what we might call fuel management in the mind. We're going to look at the moment-to-moment mechanics of how the mind actually constructs its own suffering. And more importantly, the specific tool these texts offer to, well, hit the brakes.
And to really understand that manual, we have to start by throwing out our conventional definition of a very common word, which is ignorance. In these texts, ignorance is not treated as a passive state. It isn't an abstract darkness, and it certainly isn't just a simple lack of information.
It's not just not knowing things.
No, not at all. Ignorance is an incredibly active mechanical process. It is the uninstructed mind automatically, reflexively directing its attention toward things that inflame it. It is an active misdirection.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because if ignorance is an active process, I want to know what that process actually looks like in real time.
It's remarkably fast.
Right. So I want you, listening right now, to imagine the exact microsecond a feeling arises in your body. Let's use a mundane example. You take the first sip of a truly perfect cup of coffee.
Great example.
Before you even have a conscious formulated thought about it, before a story forms in your head about how much you needed this caffeine or how great the roast is, what is actually happening in the mind. Because my assumption has always been that there's just a raw sensation, and then I decide if I like it or not.
The texts argue that your assumption skips a crucial hidden step.
A hidden step.
Yes, there is a movement that happens before the conscious decision, described using the concept of the Anusaya. We usually translate this as latent tendencies, but you can visualize it more like a leaning.
A leaning.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The dialogue in these sources breaks down this pre-verbal directional bias. When a pleasant feeling arises, like that perfect sip of coffee you mentioned, Anusaya stirs underneath.
And what does that mean exactly?
This is a latent lust or greed. The mind senses the pleasantness and, without asking your permission, immediately leans forward. It signals a rapid command. This is good, keep it, secure it, make it last.
Wow. I can actually feel that leaning when I pay close enough attention. It's that microscopic tension of wanting the second sip before I've even swallowed the first.
That's exactly it. That's the leaning.
But I imagine this directional bias operates differently depending on the input, right?
Yeah.
What happens if the feeling isn't a great cup of coffee, but something unpleasant? Say, reading a highly critical email from your boss, or even just stubbing your toe.
In those instances, Anusaya stirs. That is the latent tendency of resistance or aversion.
So it's the opposite motion.
Correct. The mind doesn't lean forward to secure it. It instantly leans backward to defend against it. It signals, this is bad, remove it, destroy it, get away from it. And again, this happens before you've even articulated the thought, I am angry at my boss. The physical and mental recoil is already underway.
That makes biological sense. We lean toward the good, we recoil from the bad. It's survival.
But the sources highlight a third category of feeling, which is where things get really subtle.
Yeah, and I found this part incredibly counterintuitive. What is happening in the mind during a neutral feeling? Think about sitting in a doctor's waiting room or staring blankly at a red light in traffic. You aren't thrilled, you aren't in agony, you're just kind of there.
That neutral state is where Avijjānusaya latent ignorance settles in, and the texts explicitly warn that neutral feeling is often the most dangerous of the three.
The most dangerous. Why?
Because a sharp pain or an intense pleasure is loud, it demands your attention, and you can clearly observe your mind reacting to it. But a neutral feeling is quiet. It lacks clarity. It hides that directional leaning under a thick blanket of dullness.
Right. Because there's no obvious threat or reward, we just assume our mind is at peace. But you're saying it's actually just zoning out, quietly reinforcing a state of ignorance.
It's essentially letting the engine idle in gear.
That's such a good way to put it. It feels like a micro-preference, a micro-resistance, or a subtle impulse to stabilize things. It's the mind working entirely on autopilot, trying to secure itself in the world before you even realize you're navigating.
And that preconceptual organization is the very foundation where the construction of suffering begins. The problem, however, is that the leaning itself, that initial Anusaya, is just the spark.
Just the spark.
Yes, and a spark alone doesn't burn a forest down.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because if that leaning is just a latent tendency, a tiny micro-preference happening in a fraction of a second, what actually gives it the power to take over our entire mood? How does the spark turn into a raging fire?
We find the mechanics of that ignition clearly laid out in the texts. They reveal that the leaning is not powered merely by the raw feeling itself.
So the pleasant sensation of the coffee on your tongue is not the culprit.
No, the raw sensation is innocent. The leaning is powered by a hidden fuel called Asāda.
Asāda. The translations usually call this gratification, but I'm struggling to see why that's a problem. Is it a crime to be gratified by a nice morning routine?
Gratification, in this specific psychological context, means the perception of reward. It is a subtle, pre-verbal belief whispering to you, this experience will complete me.
Oh, wow.
Or, this sensation will give me something I fundamentally lack. It isn't just enjoying the taste, it is attaching a glow of promise to the feeling. It's the belief that securing this feeling will provide lasting security for your identity.
So it's the brain inflating the value of the experience. It's taking a simple sensory input and turning it into a promise of salvation, however small.
Exactly. And the sources use this absolutely phenomenal analogy of a bonfire to explain this process.
Right, the bonfire. Let's dig into that.
You have a blazing fire, which represents tancha, or craving. We usually think the goal of a spiritual practice is to violently dump water on the fire to suppress our human experience. But the Buddha points out a much simpler truth. A fire only burns because you keep throwing dry grass and logs onto it.
And the dry grass is the gratification.
The dry grass is Asāda. When you experience a pleasant feeling and your mind secretly adds that layer of this will complete me, you are actively throwing dry grass onto the fire of craving.
That is so clear.
Without that specific perception of reward, the craving cannot sustain itself. The text lays out a literal chain reaction.
Walk us through that chain.
Vedana, the raw feeling, triggers the leaning. The leaning is energized by Asāda, the gratification, and that gratification explodes into tancha, full-blown craving.
Which means suffering isn't just something that passively happens to you because the world is difficult. It is an active construction project. You are building it, moment by moment, fuel by fuel.
Precisely. And because it is actively constructed, the construction process can be interrupted, the mechanics can be dismantled. The challenge lies in our modern attempts to interrupt it, which often completely miss the mark.
I want to dig into that because it feels like a massive trap for anyone who has ever dabbled in meditation or mindfulness.
It is a very common trap.
Right, like if you download a mindfulness app, the most common advice you'll hear is just watch your feelings. Or when a subtle, pleasant feeling arises, the instruction is often to shift into appreciation. Just be present and appreciate the beauty of the moment. That sounds incredibly wholesome to me. Are these ancient texts suggesting that modern advice is flawed?
Viewed through the rigorous lens of these texts, that advice is often a subtle trap due to a critical timing problem.
A timing problem.
Yes. By the time you are consciously telling yourself to dwell on gratification or appreciate how nice something feels, the leaning has already fully formed. The dry grass has already been thrown onto the bonfire.
So the spark has already ignited the fuel, and I'm just sitting there watching it burn, thinking I'm being mindful.
You are observing the fire, yes, but you haven't stopped feeding it. We have to distinguish between refinement and release.
Refinement and release. Tell me more about that distinction.
Deliberate appreciation often carries a hidden, lingering desire. You think, this is a beautiful moment, I want it to continue. That is merely a subtler, more socially acceptable form of craving.
So I've just dressed it up.
Exactly. You have refined the gratification to feel elevated or spiritual, but the underlying mechanical process, the mind trying to secure a fleeting feeling to complete itself, remains entirely intact.
Man, that is a tough pill to swallow. I might think I'm being incredibly zen by intensely appreciating a sunset, but I'm actually just making the fire of craving burn with a slightly different color.
A softer flame, maybe, but still a flame?
How can you, listening right now, actually tell the difference in your own mind? Because distinguishing between wholesome appreciation and subtle craving, Sounds nearly impossible in the moment.
It's difficult, but the sources provide a highly specific diagnostic test for this exact dilemma.
Okay, what's the test?
When that feeling of appreciation arises, you must observe its effect. Does it produce a subtle brightening and an extension of the feeling? Does your mind subtly reach out, wanting to stretch the moment into the next second?
I definitely do that. I want the good moments to last just a little bit longer.
If the answer is yes, gratification is still operating, the fire is still being fed.
And the alternative. If I'm not brightening and stretching it, what should I be feeling?
The alternative is a distinct sense of cooling. It is a profound ease where there is absolutely no leaning forward, no gripping, and no projection into the future.
The moment just is.
The moment is allowed to simply end. If that cooling is present, wisdom is operating. The intervention must happen at the level of meaning, rather than attempting to manage the emotional tone.
So what does this all mean for our daily lives? If just observing is too late because the grass is already thrown and appreciating is often just a sneaky way of feeding the fire, how do we actually intervene? How do we stop the bonfire?
We employ the core tool outlined in the sources, Yoniso Manasikara, which translates to wise attention.
Wise attention.
Yes. Wise attention is a diagnostic orientation that intervenes incredibly early. It intervenes at the exact microsecond attention lands on the feeling, fundamentally altering how the mind interprets the raw data.
I'm struggling with the logistics of that, honestly. If the leaning happens before I even have a conscious thought, how am I supposed to catch it with wise attention? Do I need superhuman reflexes?
What's fascinating here is that it doesn't require speed as much as it requires a pre-established framework.
A framework.
The texts use the concept of seeing the danger, or adinava, in the feeling.
Danger. That sounds intense. Should I be afraid of my morning coffee?
Danger in this context does not mean fear or paranoia. It means clearly seeing the instability, the unreliability, and the absolute cost of clinging to that feeling.
Oh, I see.
It is applying the Four Noble Truths as a real-time lens. When the raw feeling hits, instead of the unwisdom kicking in and whispering, "This is good for me, this will complete me," the framework of wise attention instantly recognizes this feeling is conditioned.
It's dukkha. It's temporary.
Exactly. It cannot provide lasting security.
So instead of the mind asking, how can I stabilize this pleasant feeling, wise attention reframes the whole field of experience. It deprives the ignorance of its whole narrative before the fire even have a chance to ignite.
That's the mechanism. You still taste the coffee, the sensory pleasure is still there, but the interpretation shifts drastically.
You strip away the Asāda, the promise of completion. You aren't fighting the feeling. You are just removing the delusional belief that the feeling belongs to you or can somehow save you.
By recognizing its fragility, the leaning simply loses its momentum. The gratification loses its shine. You stop fighting the gears of the machine and simply pull the plug.
Which perfectly sets us up to tackle one of the most famous phrases in all of Buddhist thought.
Yes, a very misunderstood phrase.
It's a phrase the sources show we almost entirely misread in the West. Sabbe saṅkhāra Aniccā. All constructions are impermanent. I will freely admit, for the longest time, I thought this just meant that solid things eventually decay. Buildings crumble, cars rust, bodies age, everything falls apart eventually.
That is a very common, very subtle ontological misreading.
Oh, ontological misreading. Let's translate that for me and everyone listening. You're saying I'm fundamentally misunderstanding the nature of what is actually decaying. Am I confusing a noun with a verb?
You are. You replace the idea of solid, eternal things with temporary, constructed things. But you are still operating under the assumption that there are static things out there in the world.
So what's the actual meaning?
One of the central discourses corrects this assumption entirely. Saṅkhāra does not refer to objects, it refers to activity.
Activity.
It is the ongoing, active, restless process of constructing.
So the phrase doesn't mean the brick house will eventually fall down. It means the very act of trying to build a solid house out of a flowing river of subjective experience is flawed from the start.
Exactly. Every act of constructing stability is itself unstable. The project of turning flowing experience into something to stand on is flawed from the beginning.
That completely flips how I think about impermanence.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it is vital to emphasize that this is not a doctrine of nihilism.
Because that's the trap, right?
Yes. Western readers often hear this and conclude, oh, so nothing is real, nothing exists, nothing matters. But the Buddha is not denying the existence of the world or your experiences.
The coffee still exists. The taste still exists.
The conditioned processes of life continue. The aggregates of form, feeling, and perception are functioning. The problem is not existence. The problem is appropriation.
Appropriation. The problem is trying to own the unownable.
Perfectly stated.
There is this dark, almost haunting quote from the text that really drove this home for me. It says, "I am being eaten by form. I am being eaten by feeling."
What a powerful image.
It paints such a visceral picture. We spend all day trying to consume experiences, consuming good food, consuming validation, consuming entertainment. And the text flips it. By trying to appropriate those fleeting feelings, they consume us. We are being eaten.
The exhaustion of daily life is largely the exhaustion of being eaten by your own aggregates. When you constantly endorse that micro-leaning, when you constantly seek gratification, you are forcing the mind to build and defend an identity around every passing sensation.
That sounds exhausting.
It is. But when wise attention sees the assembling merely as assembling, the tension dissipates. The feeling still arises and the feeling still ceases. But the desperate project of building a self out of it collapses.
You literally stop being eaten by your own experiences.
Yes. The need to stand anywhere at all completely relaxes.
Let's take a breath and recap the incredible architecture we've just mapped out for you. We started with a raw, baseline feeling. We saw how the uninstructed mind immediately responds with an Anusaya, a pre-verbal leaning or bias.
The directional push.
Right. And then we discovered that this leaning is secretly fueled by Asāda, the false promise of gratification that whispers, "This will complete me."
The dry grass on the bonfire.
Exactly. And finally, we explored how to cool that entire engine down. By utilizing Yoniso Manasikara, wise attention, we can see the fundamental instability of that constructing process before it erupts into the raging fire of craving. It really is a brilliant mechanical masterclass in mental fuel management.
It provides a map of ignition and cooling that you can observe in real time. The call to action for you, listening to this, is to practice a highly refined investigation in your own daily routine.
So how should they apply this today?
The next time a pleasant feeling arises, do not merely notice it and do not immediately try to appreciate it. Try to catch the exact moment it promises you continuity. Catch the microsecond where the sensation whispers, "This will give me something."
Catch the spark before it hits the dry grass.
Exactly. If you can see that promise as unreliable in that very moment, the fire simply cannot sustain itself.
As profound. But before we wrap up, I know there is one final implication of this text that pushes this concept even further.
Yes. This raises an important question, especially regarding something we discussed earlier, neutral feeling.
The quiet dullness.
The texts explicitly warn that neutral feeling is the most dangerous because it hides our latent tendencies under dullness. Think about this for a moment. If we spend our whole lives fiercely investigating our obvious moments of pleasure and our obvious moments of pain, are we completely ignoring the quietest, most mundane moments of our day?
Wow.
What would happen to your mind if you started applying wise attention precisely to the moments when you feel absolutely nothing at all?
That is a terrifying and profound question. We spend so much energy managing the highs and the lows, but the idle moments might be where the real trap is set. I want you to take that thought with you as you navigate the quiet spaces of your day this week. What is happening in your mind when nothing is happening at all?
It's the ultimate investigation.
It really is. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Your curiosity is what makes these explorations so rewarding. Keep observing, keep questioning, and we will catch you on the next one.